by way of citations, I'll be taking some thoughts from this book, Toward an Evangelical Public Policy, that was put out by the NAE, and this companion document for the health of the nation, an evangelical call to civic responsibility. There's some copies of the booklet in the back. Also, our magazine, Evangelicals. And this others I'll leave up here if you want to look at it afterwards. You're welcome. I want to start by posing a few questions. Should Christians engage in the public square? Should they vote, advocate, lobby, protest, give money or time to campaigns, work for a government agency, or run? I don't think so.
They're all on, so that's not on.
Should I use a microphone?
Would you like a mic in the back?
Yeah,
I think so.
Thank you.
That'll work? Much better. All right, so I'm posing some questions. If they do, should churches rally behind them? What about pastors, churches, denominations? Should they seek to influence public policy, legislation, or even elections? Are certain issues singularly important so that they trump valid but lesser concerns when political choices must be made? And if the answer to any of these questions is yes, then what tone or posture of engagement is most honoring to God? Yeah.
Can we switch to maybe try this guy?
I just know how to use sound.
Yeah.
I'll just put this. I'm going to put this right in front.
There we go.
Okay.
Yeah.
Does that work? Okay.
They're all on, so we have to.
And what biblical or theological understandings underpin this engagement? What approaches are most impactful, either in policy outcomes or in effective Christian witness? So these are questions that are almost as old as Christianity itself. They're strikingly relevant in our own time, where unreflective impulses to both quietism and activism abound. Questions about how Christians of diverse political persuasions and commitments should behave toward one another. When political allegiance precedes and predominates in social relations, even churches, as we've heard, divide into partisan camps. Now, faced with the impossibility of pleasing everyone, some pastors choose to double down on partisan rhetoric on one side or the other, skirting or openly violating legal prohibitions on electioneering. Others may shirk public theology altogether and opt rather for a privatized gospel that leaves the implications of Jesus' lordship over all of creation neglected. So this leaves believers to work out their political principles and commitments without the rich resources of their faith. Of course, many pastors are faithfully serving. We thank God for them, and they're blessing their communities. And of course, it's the outliers that get the most attention. So I want to suggest just a few principles, 4 principles, foundational principles, and then we'll talk about some political and Christian responsibilities. So these are familiar theological themes. First, Imago Dei, the fact that all people are created in God's image. And this means that, as we've already heard from Daryl, we all have intrinsic worth and dignity, not tied to productivity or even to behavior. And our public as well as private actions must uphold this fundamental truth. Second, love of neighbor, because God is a loving Trinity, 3 persons in one. God's image bearers are not islands unto themselves, but members of families and communities. Hence, Jesus' summary of the law as loving God and loving neighbor. People are nested within families, communities, and nations. We navigate life together in these larger groupings through our participation in diverse social institutions, including churches, schools, businesses, charities, labor unions, civic organizations, and government. Luke Bretherton reminds us that politics is the only means we have for living well with strangers and enemies, and that he has the cover article in that magazine I put out there. When I meet someone I disagree with, dislike, find strange, or threatening, says Bretherton, I can do one of four things. I can kill him. I can create a structure of domination so I can control him. I can make life so miserable that he runs away. Or I can do politics. Politics, in other words, is a way of honoring the Imago Dei and loving our neighbor by negotiating our common life peacefully. Recognizing the Imago Dei also saves us from arrogance and condescension. Third, Jesus is Lord. As Creator, God rules over all. God did not wind up the world and walk away. All things were created by, through, and for Christ, and all things are held together in Him, we read in Colossians 1. Accordingly, we recognize the Lordship of Christ and engage with all of society to demonstrate and live into this truth. To restrict our political concerns to matters that touch only on the private and domestic spheres would be to deny the all-encompassing Lordship of Jesus. Philippians 2. And finally, the kingdom of God. Jesus announced the arrival of God's kingdom and taught and invited his followers to enter the kingdom through repentance. He used a variety of parables, images, and metaphors to describe the kingdom. Like a tiny seed, its growth is hidden at first, but later visible. Like yeast, it produces changes from the inside out. The kingdom is comprehensive in its reach, but paradoxical in its methods. The fullness of the kingdom awaits the Parousia, but through the mystery of Jesus' death on the cross, all rebellious rulers and authorities have already been disarmed by God, Colossians 2. Political engagement that is aligned with God's kingdom will be gracious, confident, and bold, and often countercultural. We have no need to be disrespectful, aggressive, or domineering. So what are our political responsibilities? A common approach to identifying the biblical basis for political responsibilities is to start with a biblical mandate for government. So we can look at key passages such as Romans 13, 1 Peter 2, 1 Timothy 2, where we see government is understood as God's gracious provision for restraining and punishing evil and promoting the general welfare. The core responsibility of citizens is understood to revolve around obedience to legitimate laws, paying taxes, praying for our leaders, and if we're citizens of a democracy, voting and petitioning our government on key concerns. Governments, like every human institution, and indeed every human being, are fallen and often opposed to God's plans for human flourishing. The late Senator Mark Hatfield observed that our interpretation of Romans 13 must be balanced by our reading of Revelation 13. Government is an instrument of God for good, but also an instrument of Satan for evil. Alexander Solzhenitsyn famously said that the line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart and through all human hearts. Of course, we didn't need Solzhenitsyn to know that, but he was right about the human heart, but of course this same line also runs through every human government, embodying and promoting both good and evil. In light of this, Christians are responsible not only to take positions on issues, but to safeguard the structures and processes of our government. Separation of powers, checks and balances, whistleblower protections all matter. We must, in the words of Nicholas Walterstorff, promote government structures that make it less likely that government will fail in or violate its task. We can also draw out other responsibilities that come from living in community at multiple levels: individual, family, church, community, and nation. As we do, it becomes obvious that many of our Christian responsibilities are also political responsibilities. There are things we do in our private capacity to partially fulfill these responsibilities, but human flourishing also requires public, political action to build awareness, pass just laws, and assure effective administration and enforcement. Most often, private and political actions are mutually reinforcing, for better or for worse. Some churches or individuals may be called to specialize in one or two areas of engagement, but collectively the church's witness is strong when we preach the whole counsel of God and seek broad application of biblical principles in our civic life. So I'll just suggest here 4 political responsibilities. This is not an exhaustive list, but just 4 to think about. First is protect life. This is one of the few areas where evangelicals mostly have come to see a strong intersection of Christian and political responsibility, especially as regards the protection of the unborn. All life, of course, deserves protection, and certainly including the unborn, and also the elderly, the physically and mentally ill, the incarcerated, those living with disabilities. Beyond preventing murder, the responsibility to protect life also involves proactive duties to create the conditions in which life can flourish. This includes just systems of education, economics, agriculture, healthcare, and more. And both public and private initiatives are needed and should cooperate for the common good in these and other areas. Secondly, steward God's creation. All people are have responsibilities that derive from our creation in God's image. Genesis 1. The mandate is repeated in Genesis 2. God put the man in the garden to work it and keep it. There's much debate about how to understand the dominion that human beings are to exercise, but for this discussion, it's enough to observe that while individuals are certainly responsible for their personal stewardship of the land and animals that they control, creation care requires shared responsibility that inevitably involves political action. No individual, family, church, or company can single-handedly guarantee clean air or water, conserve the land, protect habitat, or prevent cruelty to animals. Creation care requires national and even international cooperation with effective enforcement of rules as well as voluntary action. Third, protect healthy families and communities. The families first described in Genesis 2, as I've said, we understand the institution of marriage and family and the communities and nations that flow from families as foundational to human flourishing. The household codes found in the epistles make clear that individuals and churches are responsible to promote healthy family life, but public policies also play a crucial role, with laws on marriage, divorce, child support, tax, education, criminal justice, social safety net, among many others, either contributing to or undermining healthy families. And finally, provide justice and support for the vulnerable. Jesus taught that our primary responsibility is to love God and to love our neighbor. Jesus offered this summary of the law, which applies in the first instance to God's covenant community, but also constitutes an essential response by all people as beneficiaries of God's proactive love. Caring for those living in poverty and vulnerability is well recognized as both a personal and a communal responsibility. The radical practice of the early church provides inspiration for personal and corporate generosity. There's also a role for government as God's servant for your good. Whatever else the good that God intends to achieve through the gift of government, It certainly involves provision of justice and care for those with the least socioeconomic status. Psalm 72, for example, opens with a prayer for the king to embody God's justice and righteousness. May he judge your people with righteousness and your poor with justice. And may he defend the cause of the poor of the people, give deliverance to the children of the needy, and crush the oppressor. The psalmist continues, for he delivers the needy when he calls, the poor and him who has no helper. He has pity on the weak and the needy, and saves the lives of the needy. From oppression and violence, he redeems their life. And precious is their blood in his sight. The Old Testament law contains a variety of provisions designed to operationalize and institutionalize protection of the vulnerable, including restrictions on usury, collateral, criminal justice, Sabbath labor, debt forgiveness, gleaning, and much more. Some of these provisions are directly relevant to our contemporary challenges, and others suggest principles that may be applied in new ways in our diverse contexts. Given the many and diverse views among the citizens, this process of applying universal principles to wise public policy will inevitably require political engagement by citizens who are well catechized in public theology. So what are our Christian responsibilities? It should be clear that all of the foregoing are Christian as well as political responsibilities. The Christian call is comprehensive, touches every area of life. The Christian call is also communal and implicates every area of human relationship, from the nuclear family to the global human family. Thus, anything of political concern is also of Christian concern. Christians, of course, have additional responsibilities that one might distinguish from our political responsibilities. We are called to take on Christ-like character, which, considering just the lists in Colossians 3, includes abandoning patterns of sexual immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and others. In their place, we are responsible to cultivate hearts of compassion, kindness, humility, meekness, patience, forgiveness, peace, and gratitude. We're also responsible to care for our families, bear witness to the gospel in word and deed, support our churches, study the scriptures, do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with God. Clearly, all of these, there are political implications to all of these responsibilities, Christian responsibilities. Growth in Christ-likeness should make us better neighbors and citizens, and a blessing to those whose lives we touch. Our political engagement will be more authentic when we adopt a Christ-like tone and posture. If we're not evidencing the fruits of the Spirit in our political engagement, we may question if we're actually growing in Christ-likeness. So, finally, a Christian approach to political engagement. As important as the context of our politics is our tone and posture, as Daryl's already told us. Much Christian political engagement bears little resemblance to the Christian virtues discussed above. There's often little that distinguishes our approach from that of non-Christians. We can be shrill, hostile, deceptive, belittling, greedy, arrogant. We often lack curiosity about what others really value and where we might find common ground despite our differences. Some roles for churches and pastors. Pastors are also Christians and citizens, and so share in the general responsibilities common to all. They model faithful citizenship in their daily lives. But they also have duties as church leaders. And here I'll just mention three. First, preaching the whole counsel of God. The Bible addresses personal morality, spiritual growth, family relationships, and other domestic virtues, and it also speaks to God's vision for justice and righteousness in the public square in all the ways we've discussed. For example, the Bible has dozens of passages addressing the treatment of strangers. But only 28% of American Christians say they've heard immigration discussed in their church in a way that would encourage them to reach out to the immigrants in their community. The Bible's clear that citizens owe taxes to the government, but even Christians frequently frame taxation as the government confiscating our money. Second, forming Christian citizens. In addition to preaching and teaching, pastors can encourage their members and congregations in ministries of both service and political engagement. Ministries of service are well understood and embraced. Most churches have a food pantry or a benevolence fund. Some churches have schools and other community development programs. Ministries of civic engagement are much less common, but no less strategic. Individuals can be trained and supported to speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, Proverbs 31:8. Some members can also be encouraged to consider callings in law, politics, public policy related fields in which they can bring biblical wisdom and compassion into the public square. Pastors can support these members without endorsing the partisan commitments that their members' ministries may entail, preserving space for others in the congregation who make different partisan choices. Pastors should also be aware of the subtle ways in which partisan leanings often powerfully are communicated through casual remarks. The church should aim to be hospitable to the diverse partisan commitments of its faithful members. And finally, speaking prophetically to the community and to its political leaders. There are times when it's appropriate for the pastor to speak a prophetic word on behalf of the congregation. This may be done through public or private meetings with government leaders, publishing op-eds, writing letters, making statements, or participating in advocacy events. On these occasions, the church's collective voice should be loving, reasonable, truthful, and nonpartisan. I also have a case study on how this might be applied in the area of global health, but in the interest of time, I will skip over that, and perhaps we can cover that in the Q&A time.
Thank you, Galen.